This is the first part of my series on the evolution of consciousness. There's a lot of confusion about consciousness. In saying that, I'm not making any sort of a criticism. It's a genuinely confusing topic. On Robert Lawrence Kuhn's recent list, there are over 200 theories of consciousness. Of these theories, many of them are not even answering the same questions. Many are compatible, some are incompatible. Many even be different ways of saying the same thing depending on who you ask. Nearly all of them are vague, and almost none of them leave any way to be tested. A core issue is the hard problem of consciousness, as stated by David Chalmers. I actually prefer to call it the mind-body problem, not due to any criticism of David, but because the problem goes back much further than the 1990s. At least several hundred years to Descartes, and even further back through Augustine and the ancient Greeks. The key question is this: we know that the mind is somehow associated with the body, but the properties of material entities don't seem to account for what it actually feels like to be conscious. No mass or motion or contraption seems to have the properties we have available to us first person in the form of our own subjective experience. In neuroscience, we study what are called the neural correlates of consciousness, states of the brain that are associated with certain conscious experiences. But nothing says that these mechanisms should be accompanied by conscious experiences in the first place. I don't have any grand theories to offer to solve the problem, but I have gained some insights by simplifying the questions at hand. I've begun to see that the way these questions are addressed generally presumes that we've already started on third base. We have a physical system and we have a mental system, and we try to wrestle some association out of this dichotomy. Some say that the mind emerges from physical stuff. Some say that every particle of matter is also mental. Some say that the world is fundamentally mental, and the physical world is an illusion. From the opposite direction, some say that only the physical world is real and that the mental world is an illusion. All these competing viewpoints take for granted that we know what the mental and material are in the first place. In my view, this is the first step into the confusion. I'm not even saying that these views are all incorrect. I only mean to say that they're not conclusions that we're currently equipped to make, though I do hope that we can make some progress in that direction with better footing. The ancient Greeks proposed that the world was made of 4 substances: earth, wind, water, and fire. They took these to be fundamental constituents of the universe. Progress was limited. When we start with incorrect primitives to reason about, advancing forward is not possible. And I believe that this is exactly what's occurring today with the mind-body problem. So let's start by zooming out to ask what makes the mental and the physical seem categorically incommensurate in the first place. In the case of the physical, we have notions of bodies and structural relationships across space and time, through forces and motion. We have techniques for measuring these relationships and expressing their regularities in precise mathematical form. These structural relationships are uniquely suited to being conveyed in abstract descriptions, often in equations, but even in language more generally. At its core, these sorts of structural properties can be fundamentally divorced from any particular instantiation of the relationship. Whether a triangle of particular dimensions is drawn with pencil or with paint, both will share identical relational properties. Properties we associate with our subjective experience, on the other hand, seem much more difficult to express in that way. I can tell a person with normal sight that my house is grayish, and they will know roughly what I mean by recalling their own experiences of other grayish houses, or even of separate gray and beige houses to reconstruct some concept of grayish. But a person born without sight is not able to make similar reconstructions. These ineffable qualitative properties are unable to be conveyed with abstract mathematics or language in the way that relational properties we associate with physical objects can be. This is the first understanding that we need to reframe the hard problem from being one about physical and mental systems to a more fundamental question about the relationship between structural and qualitative properties. When we look at it in a simpler light, it almost goes without saying that we can never hope to derive the qualitative properties from the structural ones, or vice versa, because the structural properties are the ones that can be abstracted away from their instantiation, while the qualitative properties are exactly the ones that require instantiation. So I actually see some interreliance of these properties on each other. An empty page is devoid of structure, but structure comes immediately as soon as the color is added. The colors here are qualitative properties. The idea is that the structural relationship is going to be embodied by some set of qualitative properties, and that any set of qualitative properties is going to instantiate some abstract relationship between them. So now that we've drawn the distinction between qualitative and structural properties, I want to revisit them in the context of physical and mental systems. Remember that our intuition about physical systems is that they are purely structural, but we have to ask, does that notion really hold up about actual physical systems? And I would say that it doesn't. Our sense of the physical being wholly structural comes largely from the mathematical way that we study the physical world, but the weight of a large mass or the destructive power of a bolt of lightning isn't remotely captured by the equations that will describe or even potentially predict exactly those occurrences. I would even suggest that the distinction between existence and non-existence on its own is equally ineffable as any property of our own subjective experience. The deeply qualitative nature of the physical world is often transparent to us. It is not as directly available as the scent of a rose or sensation of a pinprick. The regularities of physical systems can be described in abstract terms, but the systems are in no way encapsulated by their descriptions. Similarly, in the opposite direction, we can see that our mental existence is not only qualitative, but also highly structured. In fact, if it weren't, we wouldn't be able to quantify the physical world for study in the first place. So the broader point here is that the physical and the mental are not in any way fundamental categories of their own, but are each instead highly complex bundles of structural and qualitative properties. We, of course, are still interested in the relationship of physical and mental systems, but for me, it's been a significant clarification that there is no conceptual incongruence between them directly. Instead, it becomes easier to see that our conceptual difficulties come specifically when trying to derive qualitative properties from structural properties. So how do we want to handle this situation? I just propose that we simply won't make that mistake. We should accept structural and qualitative properties as interrelated but impossible to entirely resolve from each other in principle. And this leaves us in exact same situation that we're in the other hard sciences. As we saw already, the equations of physics tell us deep regularities about the physical world, but they can't encapsulate the actual existence they describe, and they don't even attempt to. In the science of consciousness, we will do the same thing. We will first acknowledge that our descriptions can only reference the qualitative properties of a system we study without instantiating or explaining those properties themselves, and then we'll proceed describing regularities in the system as in any other science. We only need to acknowledge this fact because there's a lot of confusion out there that we actually can derive qualitative properties from structural ones, or at least wonder at why we can't. When studying consciousness, measurements may be more difficult or less precise than in physical circumstances. Additional sources of error may be introduced that we have to contend with, and there may be even additional barriers to furnishing evidence or falsification in certain instances. But the general form of the enterprise is exactly the same as we have in any other hard science. So in my work, I've put this distinction of structural versus qualitative properties into practice. No final answers have popped out, but I've managed to make some sharp, even if prefatory progress that you'll see in this video series. And I hope you'll continue watching to follow my progress and share your own thoughts.